no problem too large for government to solve and no concern too small for it to care about.
A voice that most people, most sane, rational people, smart people, agree is one of the most conservative voices in the state of Wisconsin and beyond.
WILL is an indispensable organization.
The essential mission is to keep the republic.
Welcome back to If You Can Keep It, a podcast created by the Wisconsin Institute for Law and Liberty. I'm here with WILL President Rick Esenberg, who joins us again as our co-host. In our last episode, we broke down the affordability crisis and why the American dream just feels so out of reach for so many Wisconsinites. So give that episode a listen if you haven't. But today we're shifting from the economy to the culture of our institutions, specifically diversity, equity, and inclusion, otherwise known as DEI. For over a decade, DEI has been an ideology of government, academia, and corporate boardrooms all over America. But as we enter 2026, the tide has turned. It started with Students for Fair Admissions v. Harvard, a significant Supreme Court case in 2023. And then, of course, the 2024 election brought in a new president and new perspectives on DEI at the federal level. We'll also talk about how these policies and the latest changes play a role in everyday life. Joining Rick and me today is Dan Lennington, Managing Vice President and Deputy Counsel at the Wisconsin Institute for Law and Liberty. Dan's the perfect guest. He leads WILL's Equality Under the Law project and has spent the last few years successfully dismantling discriminatory programs across the country. Welcome, Dan. Welcome, Rick.
Hello. Happy to be here.
Well, Rick, let's start off with you. It would be great to set the groundwork for this discussion a little bit about how bad DEI has gotten over the past decade. Walk us through kind of what got us to 2023 and 2024.
Well, to some degree, I think these things are cyclical. We have this kind of cycle of being very, very concerned, I think almost to the point of moral panic about racial equity. And then we swing back, I think, to a more measured approach to the issues of race that focus more on anti-discrimination and individual opportunity. What we saw in the right around the onset of the 20s was a renewed emphasis on group proportionality, a great deal of criticism about American history around race, and panic about whether or not we were doing enough to address that history. A lot of people will trace that to the reaction to the killing of George Floyd. And that certainly was part of it. I mean, that was a point at which there were a lot of demonstrations, sometimes riots in the street. I think to some degree it started before that. We recall the Colin Kaepernick episode in the NFL, and players who were taking a knee in the national anthem. That was in the early years of the Trump administration in the teens. The 1619 Project, which took a very pessimistic view of American history and sort of tried to recast the country as something that was founded in racism and slavery, was actually in 2019. It was before George Floyd. So, all of this happened. And what we saw at the beginning of the Biden administration was an extraordinary move toward racially explicit preferences in hiring and the distribution of government benefits. Some of that, as you point out, was in academia. It was in the business of generally large publicly held companies, but we were also seeing it now by the government. That wasn't new. We've had affirmative action in government programs for a long time. But this was extraordinarily explicit. I mean, they weren't hiding behind anything else. They were simply saying, look, we're going to give priority to Black applicants in the distribution of restaurant revitalization funds after the pandemic. We're going to forgive farm loans, but only the loans of Black farmers. And so this is what prompted us to decide that we needed to take a more aggressive posture towards combating this stuff. We thought that there was a need to have even more capacity nationally to do that. We thought that we had the horses to do it. So, we began to challenge these programs, not only in Wisconsin, but also across the country. And that was about the time that we brought Dan on, and we embarked on on this mission. I do agree with you, Pat, that it's it's receding a little bit. I think that there's a recognition that perhaps all of this has gone too far. I think SFFA was a significant decision by the Supreme Court. It wasn't, a lot of people say that this broke new ground and now the Supreme Court had finally turned its back on affirmative action. I don't actually agree with that. I think the court has been pretty consistent over 50 years about what it will not permit in terms of racial preferences, but it had this little carve out for university admissions to obtain a diverse student body. And I think in SFFA, the court not only rejected that, but rejected it with remarkable clarity in a way that I think is going to help litigants, not only in future cases around affirmative action in universities, but also in other areas. So it's receded, but if we look at history, I think we can expect it to come back because it's cyclical. And so, perhaps we've reached peak woke for now, but I don't think we've seen the end of woke yet. My guess is that they'll call it something else. It used to be political correctness, then it became woke, and now I don't know. I don't know what it'll be in its next iteration.
I do want to get into that kind of the rebranded DEI, but first, Dan, why don't you, Rick brought up peak woke. What did that look like in real life for people?
I would say that January 20th, 2021 was really the day that it all started as far as the federal government's concerned. That's the day that President Biden issued what he called his whole of government racial equity executive order and just completely turned all the spending, all the regulatory authority, all the enforcement powers of the federal government, turned it towards equity. And that's a big ship. That's, trillions of dollars a year. And we took a look at this and found that during that period, 2021, 2022, Congress and President Biden worked together to create over 120 separate new race-based programs. Now, as Rick says, these were explicitly favoring certain racial groups and disfavoring other racial groups. It accounted for, by my count, $124 billion in annual spending. So it's $124 billion every single year. This is new spending. Starting in 2021, people may remember the names of these acts: the American Rescue Plan Act, the Inflation Reduction Act, the Bipartisan Infrastructure Act. I mean, President Biden really had some landmark legislation that he passed and was successful to get through. So as far as a legislature, he got a lot done. I mean, the worst of the worst, there was things like $10 billion, a homeowner assistance fund to help people struggling with utilities, rent, and mortgage and repairs on their home. It was reserved for people of certain minorities. $10 billion for small businesses, priorities, again, to minority businesses. And Rick mentioned, $28.6 billion for restaurants, $4 billion for farmers. All these were tainted with racial priorities and preferences. But this also trickled down into state, local governments, universities, especially schools. What we saw in 2021, 2022 was this sort of DEI madness that took over at the local level. We saw students that were racially segregated on field trips. We saw parents that were racially segregated in meetings. We had students as young as kindergarten being forced to acknowledge their white privilege. Teachers were told not to discipline students because they don't need to hear rules from another white person. That's a direct quote I heard from a teacher. Of course, the discipline policy was another trickle down from the federal government, which had a race-based discipline policy for all K through 12 schools. Students evaded punishment for violent acts on school buses and hallways because of their race. We've heard from multiple times from multiple teachers at local levels that they were, quote, told to meet with your Black students first and more often. So this wasn't just something that President Biden was doing with the executive branch. It was going through Congress, trickling down through the states to the local levels, all the way down to our schools. And then, of course, in sort of a reaction to the summer of 2020, corporations obviously got involved, and there was, the reports indicate that they had pledged $340 billion in racial equity spending. Now, these were things like programs like home ownership support for Black families. These are direct quotes, still on their websites, by the way. A lot of these big banks like Wells Fargo, supporting economic empowerment for Black communities, supporting Black-owned small businesses, like hundreds of billions of dollars then coming out from the corporate world and sort of this DEI spending. So you had congressional action, state, local, foul law action, and then this corporate spending spree that really is what, for me, really tells you what those 4 years were like, what that 2021 to 2023 or 24 era was like. It's just a massive amount of spending in order to, quote, help people, when what they were doing was trying to balance out racial outcomes, which meant preferring certain racial groups over others. And so anytime you help one group, you're obviously going to hurt someone else who's not eligible for that program. So that's how I see this sort of period of DEI madness, or woke, peak woke, as you said.
Well, I do think, this peak wokeness, Dan's talking about from 2020, basically, or 2021, when Biden was sworn in, it took us to the 2024 election. I do think we saw a little bit of a backlash. I think part of what fueled maybe a Trump win was this tiredness of wokeness. I think if you look at exit polling data, for example, I think, we saw a lot of college-educated white men was actually probably the biggest mover towards the president. In addition to even, I think, working class Hispanics, and so that kind of built, I think, this coalition that I think Trump took full advantage of in the November election. And that takes us to January of 2025, when the new president is sworn in, and he rolls out a huge, basically executive order package to undo DEI policies. And so, Dan and Rick, I want you to talk. We'll start with Dan. Just talk a little bit about that. Like, what did the Trump administration do? Dan, why don't you walk us through that?
So in January 2025, we saw Trump starting to roll out executive orders. By my count, in 2025, there were 10 major executive orders, all targeted at DEI, aimed at DEI in federal agencies, ordering investigations of corporations, attacking universities for having DEI, reforming school discipline, ending disparate impact. It just goes on and on. Even there's an executive order on DEI on artificial intelligence, or there's an executive order of DEI in investing. So a lot of just top-down executive orders trying to root this out. But of course, the problem is the next president can just undo these things. And so really the ironclad way to get rid of all this race-based spending, race-based programs is to change the law. And that's something only Congress can do.
My question more for Rick is, if you had to give the Trump administration a grade on their work to end DEI in government, like an A through F, like, what do you think? I mean, what do you think that would be, and why?
Well, I would give them probably a B plus, and I wouldn't give them more than that, because they haven't attempted to go to Congress. Now, I understand the argument. We have a filibuster in the Senate. You never get it through the Senate. But I think that you need to go beyond simply adopting a series of EOs or even rule changes. And even if you think that it's going to be difficult to get something through Congress, you've got to put the other side to the hard choice of whether or not they're going to vote against something or not, because racial preferences are not popular. And I think it's very important for us to not only win the battle against them legally, right, in court or by legislation through Congress, but also to reaffirm and strengthen the notion that equity is not determined by group proportionality. That we don't have a system in which we want equality among groups where each group gets its own share of the jobs, its own share of the government largesse. The subject of moral concern here is the individual. This is what the civil rights movement was about. This was what I think in his public statements, Martin Luther King was about, that each of us should be treated as individuals by the content of our character and not the color of our skin. And that principle is something that we not only need to establish legally, but we need to reaffirm culturally, because you saw, in this sort of recent swing towards, what I call racialism. The idea that, well, what we really are after here is not fairness for individuals, but fairness for groups. And as Justice Scalia pointed out in one of these cases, challenging race-based government decision-making, that's just not the way our Constitution is set up. What we are concerned about is not the right of demographic groups or artificially constructed groups, but of human beings, of men and women who have a right to be treated as individuals and, not as interchangeable members of some group.
So, answer this question then. What, is diversity a strength? Diversity through strength or strength through diversity. Why is that a wrong way to look at it? And Dan, I know you're smiling. You should be able to answer this question too. We'll let Rick go first.
Well, I mean, sometimes it is and sometimes it isn't. There's a lot of research that shows circumstances in which diversity is not a strength because it undermines solidarity, it undermines consensus, and it weakens, the willingness of people to cooperate. It sort of erodes civic trust. Now, we don't want that to happen with race, right? We had that for a long time. And, Charles Murray wrote a book a couple of years ago in which he pointed out that, if we really want to get past the racism in our history, and it was there, and there's no doubt about that, the last thing we want to do is to encourage people to think of themselves once again as members of racial groups. We've had experience with that. I mean, that was our history up to the Civil War. That was our history in the South up to the Civil Rights Movement, maybe even beyond the South. And it didn't turn out well. And so what I think we need to do and what we I think are trying to advance here and will in our little way is the notion that we just don't make decisions on the basis of individuals' race. We make it based upon individuals and whatever is relevant about them as individuals to whatever decision it is that we're making. And so, is diversity our strength? Yes, if it means non-discrimination. Yes, if it means treating people as individuals and not as members of racial groups. No, if it means allocating things to people based upon their membership in a group.
Yeah, Dan, I mean, diversity is our strength or no? I mean, what do you think about what Rick just said?
I agree completely. It's, in my view, diversity as our strength is a political tool because they mean racial diversity. When the left says diversity, they're only meaning racial diversity. And what they're saying is that in certain areas, in certain jobs that have more white people than they would like fewer white people. And vice versa. So for example, you never hear like, we need more diversity in nurses in Milwaukee County. because a majority of nurses in Milwaukee County are already minority. So no one ever says like, we need more white nurses in Milwaukee, or we need more white anesthesiologists in Frederick Hospital System. They don't say that, they don't say like, we need more black garbage truck drivers in Oconomowoc, Wisconsin. All the garbage truck drivers are too white in that city. We need more black garbage trucks. So it's always sort of a one-way ratchet, and that's what gives it up as a sort of a political tool. What they're saying is that we want to have more people in this racial group in this preferred job, in less minorities in this area that's less preferred, lower paying, less prestigious job. And so it's really like a function of getting our political supporters in the jobs or the areas that we want them in, rather than actual racial diversity. They don't say, well, we don't have enough Hispanics, in the National Football League. No, I mean, nobody says there's not enough Hispanics in the National Football League, although they're disproportionately represented. And in other areas like that, it's sort of a silly game, because it's only in the preferred jobs or the high prestige jobs that there's some sort of indication that some sort of group should be in or should be out of that thing, which sort of gives up their sort of political motivation for the whole thing, in my view.
I wanted to bring up an article written by Jacob Savage called The Lost Generation. It was in a Compact magazine. I sent it to you guys.
Pat, I was just about to bring that article up.
Excellent. Well,
Great.
then let's go for it. I mean, I want to read one line from it really quick. I think it jumps out to you in this story is, this quote is, the world, it's kind of targeted towards younger people. The world, and obviously white, non-diverse per se, the world is not rooting for you. In fact, it is deliberately rooting against you. I think, as someone who follows politics pretty closely, I think that shaped kind of the reaction in 2016 and 2024 that we saw with the Trump era. It's really created anger and divide and really, I think, held people back per se. But Rick, why don't you go ahead? You were going to bring this up.
Well, look, this is a particular iteration of Murray's point. He talks a lot about Hollywood in that article, and there's some really, really stark statistics about fellowships for people who want to get screenwriting jobs, and they give away 107 of them or something like that over a decade, and none of them are given to white men. You have writers' rooms in which, sure, you'll find white males there, but only the old ones, only old boomers and like me and Gen X guys who got their job before all of this shifted into high gear. If you look at the hiring and the grants of tenure in social studies and humanities departments in Ivy League schools, the statistics are just astonishing. Where you have over a lengthy period of time, 5 to 6% of these positions being extended to white males. And the problem is, as Roy pointed out, is that that these white males are going to notice, and they're not going to take it well. And so it is almost a recipe for having a kind of backlash. And if you're a racial minority, you ought not want to adopt a set of policies that encourage white people to think of themselves as white people again, as a group that has to band together and assert its interest as a group. This is what we were trying to get away from in the civil rights movement. And so, I don't like a lot of the backlash that we see on the right among younger males. I think it's misguided. I think it's dangerous. I think it's wrong. But to some extent, when you look at a world in which all group identities are celebrated and included, and yours is sort of disparaged, and you're defined as a problem to be solved, like possessing something called whiteness, which is a bad thing. Um, you know, there are people who will say, all right, I'm going to do my mea culpa, get down on my knees and take what's coming to me. But most people won't. And so I think that, even if you're not persuaded by, the moral imperative that was behind the civil rights movement, you should be persuaded by the practical realities and the stuff that is likely to happen if we abandon the notion of equality and anti-discrimination, and we replace it by this uh, new definition of equity and anti-racism.
What advice do you give to people who are kind of fighting this in their real life right now?
Yeah, when I read that article, I was reminded of a series of conversations I had with a cinematographer from Hollywood. And he was a white male, and he used to call me and complain about what was going on in Hollywood. The guilds would have these sort of hiring web pages for cinematographers, and they used to have it separated by race. And he says eventually they got rid of that, but they replaced it with photographs. So anybody who wanted a cinematographer job had to have his photograph on this web page, and then they were hired based on that. And he knew this racism was going on, that he was losing out on jobs to Apple and Amazon and Paramount and all the big studios. And then he said, well, the problem was that actually when he got hired as a cinematographer, they also hire all the cameramen. And so he would hire, 3 cameramen or 4 cameramen. And then the studio would come back and say, well, we want you to hire a couple of African-American cameramen. And he would say, well, I have to replace my crew? He'd say, no, just add them on. And so he would typically have 3 or 4 or 5 cameramen that he hired that he thought were qualified. And then there would be these 2 or 3 African-American cameramen. And I would ask him, what would they be doing? And he'd say they would just be sitting around. And I say, what are they happy? No, they are not happy, because they know why they're there. And so it's not just that the white males are figuring out what people in the studios believe about them and feel about them. There's other victims here, and there are the victims who are told by the actions that they're actually there for some tokenism or some other reason, and that we all acknowledge you're not really qualified to be here, but we're going to put you here for some larger political purpose, which victimizes those African-American cameramen who are just sitting there doing nothing all day long and feeling like their self-worth and dignity is being diminished, and they are feeling like their race is the most important thing, which is harmful to those people, which is, I find, really offensive. And so, like, to people who tell me stories like this, I say, well, you've got to decide whether you want to take some legal action. And a lot of times people say that they don't want to take legal action. They're afraid of retaliation, or they're afraid of losing their job, or they don't want to be the person who fires or is suing their employer. And so it is a difficult conversation. We've talked to a lot of them over the last 5 years about people who have experienced this discrimination or seen this horrible effects on people. And a lot of them leave their jobs. They go elsewhere. They work for other people. They say things like, I've heard people tell me, well, I quit and I'm working for a smaller company, and my boss doesn't believe in any of that DEI stuff. And I'm so relieved now because I don't have to go to that workplace anymore. So I think there's a lot of people who have just voted with their feet. They've moved jobs, they've moved industries, they've moved away from things. And there's been quite a shift in our employment. I don't know how we would ever measure that, but then there are people who have stood up and decided that they want to sue and they want to go to court and get a victory for all other people. And those people who we've talked to have been very happy at the end of the day that they stood up for their industry. Some of our clients in the road building industry in particular have just gotten so many calls from other road builders saying, thank you for standing up because things are getting better for us because you were brave and you did the right thing. But of course, we recognize that's not for everybody. But yeah, this putting people in these racial boxes hurts everybody, not just the purported beneficiaries. But it hurts people who are left out, and it causes these sort of hard decisions about what you want to do with your life.
A lot of times what you'll hear is that, well, I don't have a lot of sympathy for these white guys because they had all the advantages in the past. And the problem with that is that those who are being denied today are not the people that had the advantages in the past. Those people are long gone. I mean, look at me. I mean, I'm an old guy. I'm a boomer, and all of this, civil rights movement was basically over by the time. I mean, had been won by the time I was in the 4th or 5th grade, and certainly it doesn't mean there's no racial discrimination. But affirmative action had been established. The fact that my grandfather or my great-grandfather may have had advantages because of the color of his skin doesn't mean that that I'm not being excluded based upon my race. I'm not the one that got the advantage. I'm not, the people that I'm competing with are not the ones who were discriminated against. And so this idea that the sins of the father should be visited on the sons, and that, we experience things as members of multi-generational cohorts that have the same color skin is it's simply not true. That's not the way human beings work.
That is an argument you'll often hear, though, is you'll hear that this is meant to correct what is a clear gap in success and achievement. And I think, Will is going to be putting out some work on this, down the road in the next couple of weeks. Dan, I mean, anything you want to address this point from the left that this is a rebalancing of the scales.
Yeah, well, they're very imprecise at how they do it. 20% of all African Americans in the United States right now are first and second generation. They've come as immigrants from Africa, yet they will receive certain benefits based on the color of their skin. Is that rebalancing? Is it rebalancing? Is it fixing discrimination that was in the Jim Crow era, the segregation era, before the Civil War? Is it fixing that discrimination to somehow give small business credits to a recent immigrant from Nigeria? And that, as I said, that population is not insignificant. That's 1 out of every 5 African Americans in this country. Of course not. Of course, that's not tailored, because something else is going on. Their racial categories are so imprecise that they can't ever figure out what they want to do, because I think it's based on politics. I think it's based on who's voting for who, and that's who's getting the benefits, not that there's some sort of cosmic justice going on. Because the cosmic justice that they're interested in, this historical justice about my ancestors getting stuff and their ancestors not getting stuff, doesn't ever actually wash out when you actually look at people's own family trees. I mean, my 5th great grandfathers all fought in the Civil War, and they came back to Indiana and they were poor farmers. And my dad grew up in a house without indoor plumbing. Where's my benefit from those poor farmers in Indiana in 1890 and 1910? Of course, I didn't get a check from them. I didn't get some sort of benefit from them. My dad surely didn't get a benefit from them growing up poor in Indiana.
Dan, I think you're unusual in even knowing who your 5th great grandfather were. I think most people, they may know who their grandfather and great grandfather was, but beyond that, it's all a mystery to them.
Yeah, that's the point, is that the left wants to talk about this in general terms, and they're happy when someone, an African American, can identify, oh, my 5th or 6th great grandfather was a slave in Alabama. That is somehow relevant. That's somehow relevant to the discussion, that individual story. But the individual story of the white person whose family moved here in the 1950s, the Italian immigrants who came in the early part of the 20th century, who had nothing to do with anything, that somehow they don't get to tell their individual story. They don't get to know their family tree, and their family tree is not relevant. And so it's all about just rough political balancing in order to get some sort of benefit from this, these social programs that are going to go to one group and not to another group. And then to call it something else, to call it, curing systemic racism, whatever you want. I don't think the left is interested in the details at all.
I still think might potentially be up for debate. One of the topics, though, I think moving from government this is happening in corporate boardrooms, and this is happening still, I think, in the private sector. And so one of the things I wanted to touch on really quick is, we have companies, we have nonprofits. They may want to hire based on race. They could claim a First Amendment right or some sort of, this is our mission statement, is to hire more people of color. Our mission statement is to help, African Americans in Milwaukee. Where do they have a right to say that? I mean, I think you guys as kind of the constitutional experts here and would potentially litigate a case in this matter. Like, what would you guys say to that?
Well, the Constitution wouldn't prohibit a private company from doing that, but we've enacted anti-discrimination laws, and there was a debate about whether the enactment of those laws was constitutional. If they were enacted by Congress, did Congress have the power to do that? Could it be justified by the Commerce Clause? Could it be justified under the enforcement provisions in the Civil Rights Amendment? Would it violate the freedom of association that has been found to exist in the First Amendment? Those battles were all fought, and they were resolved, right? And they were resolved by concluding that, yes, we can have anti-discrimination laws, even federal anti-discrimination laws. And so if that's the rule, then these private entities, I think, at least if they otherwise qualify under the provisions of the statute, can't get away with this. And they're going to be prohibited from doing it, not on constitutional grounds, but on statutory grounds. That's a little narrow in its application, but nevertheless, that's the law.
Dan, I think I'd like you to answer this question as well, about kind of what is the corporate, whether it's the board members themselves or the higher up leadership, the people making the decisions, the company. Companies are people in a sense, right? Like, what is their right to push a mission like I described?
Yeah, I think it's pretty clear that our anti-discrimination laws cover this. They cover purely private conduct. I have the privilege of teaching civil rights litigation at the University of Wisconsin Law School, and the first class we talk about are the Reconstruction Acts, the acts passed in the 1860s by Congress, by the Republicans in Congress, that almost uniformly are aimed at private conduct. These laws prohibit race discrimination in the creation of contracts or the implementation of contracts, race discrimination in private property transactions. And these were litigated, in the 20th century about, there were certain builders, guys who built homes that didn't want to sell their homes to African Americans, and Black plaintiffs brought these lawsuits under the federal statutes that prohibit race discrimination in real estate, for example, and they won handily. And there were private schools that excluded Black students, and what the Supreme Court says, well, when you're paying to go to a private school, you're creating a contract. And back in 1866, Congress said that it was illegal to discriminate in the provision of contracts, private contracts, and that is authorized actually by our 13th Amendment, which gets rid of the badges and incidents of slavery. And so the Congress had very broad power to reach private conduct, which was confirmed by the Supreme Court up until the 1960s. And then in the 1960s, the Congress discovered another way to get at private conduct by using the Commerce Clause, which is a much more expansive authority than even the 13th and 14th and 15th Amendments provide. And so really there's not a lot of limit on what Congress can do to prohibit private race discrimination. And that's a great thing. And that's a great tool. And we use those tools every day at will. There is some First Amendment issues, and people have raised these recently, such as there's a case called Fearless Fund, which was a case down in Georgia about a private nonprofit that wanted to give out business grants to women who were Black. And their defense in that case was, hey, this is just First Amendment. We want to associate only with Black women entrepreneurs. We don't want to associate with other entrepreneurs. And we're actually a charity. And that case lost. The Fearless Fund lost because what they were doing were actually creating contracts, a quid pro quo contract. I think this leaves open the really narrow area of charitable giving and charities that may give to a specific racial category with no strings attached, no contract involved, no property involved, no employment involved, maybe a direct grant or a scholarship. But even in those very, with no government involvement at all, even in those areas, it's very risky. I've been on some of the websites of these associations that run scholarships, and they even have little notations. They say this scholarship may be illegal under federal civil rights laws. So that's really an open question. But I think whatever that question is, it's very narrow. About the issue about charitable giving to certain racial groups is a narrow issue, but it's still probably something that will be litigated.
We're at the beginning of 2026. We've seen now a year of the Trump administration in office. We've seen the DEI battle kind of wage into corporate America. I'm going to just throw out there, we hear a lot about people losing jobs to, AI or getting their resumes filtered out through artificial intelligence. Like, is that a potential way to shield liability for these companies? Is that something I think I'd like for you guys to address? And then more broadly, what is next in the fight to dismantle DEI in 2026? So, Rick, if you want to take a stab at one of those first, and then we'll go to Dan.
Well, I think that we're probably now. I mean, the law is pretty good on this in this area, but this is something that has been in existence to various degrees for a very long time, and it's going to take a long time to dismantle this. And as I said before, although the energy and enthusiasm behind it seems to have waned a bit over the past couple of years, I don't think that's permanent. Very few things in politics ever are permanent. So I think that there will be a wave of racialism which will return, and so I think this is going to be an ongoing struggle. But I think eventually, we'll reach, some type of, we always hear our friends on the left talking about having a reckoning about race. Finally, we're going to have a reckoning of, the legacy of slavery or Jim Crow in the South. I think we will eventually come to a reckoning, and that reckoning will look something like this. It will be a widespread understanding that this country was conceived in both equality and liberty, that as all human creations and entities, we were imperfect. We didn't live up to that. We're still struggling to live up to that because this side of the veil, we never reached perfection. We had a civil war. We had a civil rights movement. And that was ultimately directed towards and has resulted in a country in which people are judged by the content of their character and not by the color of their skin. We don't shy away from understanding our past and admitting where we were wrong. But at the same time, we're not paralyzed by the fact that we did wrong in the past. We don't hate our country. We don't regard some of our countrymen as possessing some type of collective or blood guilt that has to be expiated. You know, we have to eliminate whiteness or we have to have payback. And I think eventually we'll get there. I think that we've made some progress over the past couple of years. I think that fight will continue, but ultimately, I think that is what the reckoning with our past will look like.
Dan, what do you think? 2026, what changes? What's new? Maybe what is the impact that people feel?
Well, we've had a year of Trump now. Rick was very astute earlier to give him a B+ at our roadmap for equality, where we document all of the changes of the Trump administration in this area related to race. Our counter is up to 89%, which I think is right. And I didn't tell this to Rick, but that actually is a B+, and 89% is a B+. So that's
for the record, he did not know that. Yes.
When I went to Catholic school, Dan, and we got numerical grades on everything, B was between 85 and 92. So that would be that would be a low B+.
The problem is that something about these race-based programs, that the purveyors of them have this, sort of Charlton Heston Second Amendment view, this out of my cold, dead hands will you take my program from me. And we've heard that from like CEOs of corporations. So for example, here in Wisconsin, Northwestern Mutual is being sued by the EEOC over their DEI programs. And we've heard sort of the management there, their position is sort of like, out of my cold dead hands, you're going to take our DEI programs. The EEOC is also going after Generac here in Wisconsin over DEI type programming and that sort of thing. We've heard this from some of the road builders who deal with prime contractors, the big corporations around the country that build these massive road projects. And even though the US DOT has gotten rid of race-based affirmative action program, its main program, we've heard in sort of Zoom calls and trainings from these contractors saying, no, we're going to keep doing it. Diversity is our strength. As we talked about earlier, it is an article of faith, that if you make a team of people more diverse, it will automatically make them better. It'll make you more money. It'll make you more profitable. And none of that's actually borne out by anything other than just a belief. And so we talk about this a lot. What's going to happen? I feel like we're going to have at least a decade more of just playing whack-a-mole with these programs. We litigate against programs. We threaten to sue people over programs. The program magically goes away and then it comes back in some other form. These school districts are not going to give up their race-based programming. They're going to have to go program to program, school to school. It certainly does help that the federal government is aligned against this stuff. So, for example, the EEOC is doing a tremendous job of going after corporate discrimination in the corporate setting. The Civil Rights Division of DOJ just today sued the state of Minnesota over their affirmative action program. They're going after states. There's also lawsuits against universities trying to do settlements, but that pressure from the top is really, really important. But if that goes away, if there's a President AOC or President Gavin Newsom, that all gets turned on its head, and then we're right back to where we were in 2021. And there's such a belief that we have to help. We as a society have to help people with a darker skin pigmentation. And that's really the only qualifier. Just as a member of the group, we have to help them, or else we're shirking our moral duties. We're being bad citizens. And I think that that belief ingrained through our public school system, through our university system, through our corporate training programs is so pervasive. I just don't think it's going to change. I don't think 10 years from now, we're going to see much difference in the way people believe that these programs are so important.
I think that's it's not the most positive summation of where things are heading, but I think that's a good accurate look at it as well. I do want to jump really quick to our Smart Take segment. I think a lot of folks who follow along with us at Will like to know what we're reading, what we're seeing. We mentioned Compact Magazine, The Lost Generation by Jacob Savage. Anyone who wants to know more on this topic, I would really recommend you read that article. But for our Smart Take segment, we'll start with Dan. Dan, what is a good source, tweet, article that someone should read to learn more about kind of the impacts of DEI in America?
I think that the best podcast I listen to on race is the Glenn Show with Glenn Lowry and John McWhorter. That's excellent. I think it's important for people to learn more about disparities, racial disparities, and so I would recommend Thomas Sowell's book that is the most recent one. It's called Discrimination and Disparities. That's out on Amazon. It's a very short read, talking about this difference between discrimination and disparities, and about a biography that I had neglected to read but just read over Christmas was My Grandfather's Son by Clarence Thomas, and it's just a amazing book about a Black man growing up in Georgia in extreme poverty and ending up on the United States Supreme Court. It is just a really a very important book. I think should be assigned in schools. It's so good. And so I would say My Grandfather's Son by Clarence Thomas is something that everybody must read.
Awesome. Those are great. Rick, how about you?
Well, in terms of, I've got books, right? So in terms of books about this topic, Dan mentioned John McWhorter. I agree. The Glenn Show is a good podcast. McWhorter, who is he's Black, he's not a conservative, but he wrote a great book called Woke Racism, which I think is worth reading. Charles Murray, who I think is perhaps the most misunderstood scholar in America, wrote a couple of books. One is really, really long and really, really dense. It's called Human Diversity. The other one is called Facing Reality: Two Truths About Race in America. I think that's it's a little shorter read. But I want to leave you with a novel that I just finished, and it's by a guy called Scott Johnson, and it's called The Sandersons Fail Manhattan, and it's about wokeness in a private girls' school and the way that it can turn into a moral panic. It's not just race, but it's this whole kind of kerfuffle we've had about marginalized classes and intersectionality and how that can distort the life of a community. And it's all about this family, the Sandersons, who were very privileged, very wealthy people in Manhattan who just want to get their daughter into Yale. And they're not wholly admirable, but it's talks about how the woke leadership of the school is manipulating all of these rich parents, and while at the same time the woke leadership of the school is being manipulated by the kids, and it's very funny and very true. Heather McDonald wrote a review of it in the Claremont Review of Books and said she couldn't tell if it was fiction or it was a piece of journalism reporting on something that had actually happened.
I think we're going to relabel this segment Smart Takes and emphasize the S, because I think both you guys did a great job giving us several examples and sources that people should be taking a look at to learn more about this topic. But again, thank you guys for a great episode. As we kind of heard, while there's some progress in the fight to end DEI and government and corporate America, the fight is far from over. I think both Rick and Dan walk through a number of kind of reasons for that and just the harm that it's causing on humanity, frankly, and especially here in America. Thanks again for a great episode, and we'll catch you next time. And you can find all our podcasts wherever, on all the outlets you get your podcasts, but also will-law.org/podcast is the best way to stay up to date with us. So we appreciate it. We'll talk soon.